All right, guys. So Lewis here, and today we have another very exciting interview because I'm interviewing Matt from Matt versus Japan, the famous YouTube channel. And so I suspect that actually a lot of people watching or listening to this interview are already going to be familiar with Matt. But still, I'm going to ask you, Matt, to introduce yourself and try to convince people who just clicked on this interview of why they should stay here and listen to your language learning advice.
Yeah. So, first of all, thanks so much for having me on because I've also been watching your channel recently. So, really glad we
Oh,
finally
yeah.
got to get to connect. And yeah, so my story is basically that I taught myself Japanese to a near native level without living in Japan. So, I was living in America for the entire time that I learned Japanese. And then I started teaching other people how to learn Japanese and also just, how to learn any language in general, really, mainly using an intensive input approach. And I think the kind of unique perspective that I bring to things is, first of all, that I have a lot of firsthand experience, right? Because I have the experience of learning a very difficult language to near native level without being in the country. But then I also try to inform myself as much as possible on the academic research that's been done on second language acquisition and just linguistics in general. But also, I think that, in my personal opinion, there can be a lot of limitations to the field of second language acquisition, mostly just because a lot of times they're dealing with, like, when they run a study, it's done on the time scale of a couple months. And there's a lot of really important things you can learn, and a lot of important things has been like brought to the light through linguistic research. But if we're talking about how to reach a near native level in the language, which for whatever reason personally has always been the question that fascinated me the most, of how do you really become as close to a native as possible in a foreign language, then that's something that takes multiple years. And so some of this linguistic research that is only really looking at what type of language ability changes can take place over a couple of months doesn't really capture all the way, right? I think some things fall through the cracks, or some things just you need a longer time scale to have that the perspective that's going to really give you the whole picture. And so I've spent a lot of time actually studying case studies. I think that that's actually one of the most valuable sources of information when we're talking about learning about how effective language learning happens, is going and finding the people that are the most impressive case studies in terms of learning a language as an adult and figuring out what they did. So I've kind of kept a personal database of all the most impressive case studies of people who've learned Japanese, mainly Japanese and Chinese, as an adult, and really sound almost completely like a native speaker. And I went and have interviewed them, talked to them, and just done research on them and figure out what exactly did they do, try to extract all the common denominators essentially, and then all those things together, my own experience, second language acquisition research, and looking into these case studies have kind of informed my view of language acquisition and how to do effective language acquisition, in addition to also just working with many students, because through the last 7 years of running my YouTube channel, I've worked with hundreds of students and have guided hundreds of people to fluency in Japanese. And so I also kind of know what type of techniques tend to work for people and not work for people. So yeah, I think I kind of have a unique perspective I haven't really seen a lot of other people offering, in terms of how to reach a near native level in the most efficient way possible.
And so in your own case, so you started out just, learning Japanese, you were in America the whole time. How long did it take you to really get to a level, I'm not going to say like a native level, but at least a level where, anyone would pretty much say that, okay, you're fluent in Japanese. How long did it take?
Yeah, so of course the word fluency is always tricky because everyone defines it a little bit differently, but I generally tend to put it on clock myself at like 2 years. I'd say I was at kind of weak level of fluency, and then 3 years I was at a very strong level of fluency. So if you wanted to go by that kind of definition of like no one would deny that you're fluent in the language, then I'd probably say 3 years of doing hardcore immersion. And for early on, there was a 6 month period that I was living in Japan on a study abroad. But when I came back from Japan, I still was pretty bad at Japanese. So I went from being pretty bad at Japanese to fluent in Japanese in America by immersing myself in Japanese media. And yeah, I'd say that it basically took 3 years.
That's pretty cool. And, for people listening, but we're not only going to talk about, learning Japanese. It just so happens that, Matt has learned Japanese. And I think it's a very good case study because Japanese is one of the, hardest languages for English speakers, at least, especially because of the the writing system. And just to be clear, you also studied the writing system, so you're also
Yeah.
fluent in writing Japanese. Yeah, okay. And so you created this channel, Matt versus Japan, which I used to watch your videos. I think not really 10 years ago, probably and 7 years ago. It's been a
Yeah.
while.
Yeah. So right when I was getting started, then probably.
Yeah, you had like definitely less than 10,000 subscribers.
Mm.
So,
Oh, that's cool.
and I always wondered, why is it Matt versus Japan? Like, it seems like there's some sort of battle going on.
Yeah, I mean, the direct reason why I chose the channel name Matt versus Japan is because I think I chose this when I was 16. So this is like, 9, 10 years ago now. And back then, every YouTube channel name had to be unique. It was actually kind of like how now, YouTube has the like at sign and then your like handle name it's like a unique username. So back then that used to be like your channel name where every channel name had to be unique. So I think my first thought was just to be like Japan Matt or something, but that was already taken. And so I kind of just chose it on a whim as a replacement of Japan Matt or Matt in Japan or something. But I think it's less that I'm battling Japan and it's more like I'm battling myself, and Japan is the place where the battle is taking place, I guess. That's kind of how I think about it. Like, I'm kind of conflicted about the name now because like, when a Japanese person hears it, I'm worried that they're going to think that I have something against Japan, right? Like I have some kind of bone to pick, when in reality it's not the case at all, right? I have been studying Japanese and everything because I love Japan. So yeah, it's kind of the thing where if I could go back, maybe I wouldn't have chose the same name, but now it's so iconic, it's too late to change. So yeah, but I think that framing of it's always a battle against myself that's taking place with Japanese culture in the background, I guess.
I guess we can say that you've won this battle. I mean, not that Japan has lost it, but you're now living in Japan and
Yeah. Yeah.
you're fully functional in Japanese society. You can interact with people, no problem, right?
Oh yeah, well actually just very recently I'm getting started with making content in Japanese for a Japanese audience. And so far that's been going pretty well, especially because through having done YouTube so long, I have a lot of other friends that make content in Japanese. So they've kind of let me be guests on their channels, and that has given me more exposure to like a Japanese audience. So I kind of have a nice running start. But yeah, I'm still just kind of new to this area of building up a Japanese audience where I speak to in Japanese. I'm planning on mostly talking about language learning and immersion and things like that, but for in Japanese, helping them use the same techniques to learn English. So yeah, maybe this is kind of the final battle of can I build the same level of kind of popularity or success that I had in English in Japanese. But so far, I'd say the battle is going pretty well. Like I don't know if it's finished yet, but I'd say things are looking pretty good.
So there's a dedicated channel for Japanese viewers.
I created one. It only has
Okay.
3 videos on it at the current time, and so I have like less than 1,000 subscribers. So it's very, very early days. I've been kind of more focused on Instagram for now, and so I have a couple shorts, and some of them got a lot of views, which is cool. But yeah, I do technically have a Japanese YouTube channel that I'm gonna start posting on more and hopefully grow up.
Cool. Yeah, because I would imagine that actually at your level of fluency, it's sort of like, in my experience at least, is that learning English when you get to a high level where people can still tell, okay, he's not a native English speaker or whatever speaker, but he speaks very well. Then people are like, wow, you speak very well and so on. But once you get to a native level, it's sort of ambiguous. Like, are you from America or are you from Japan? And so people are not really impressed anymore. I don't know if you see what I mean here.
Oh yeah,
Once you
yeah,
get too
definitely.
good at it, it's like,
Yeah.
I don't know. People think that you've just lived in the country for years, essentially, so they're not impressed anymore. But I'm guessing that for Japan, it's a little bit different because whenever Japanese people see non-Japanese people speak fluent Japanese, then they're always sort of impressed. Is that still the
Yeah,
case for you?
yeah. Yeah, I'd say that it's definitely different in the case of learning Japanese because, well, first of all, there's just the fact that most like 99% of native Japanese speakers look Japanese ethnically. And so just the fact that I'm white and I don't look Japanese, even if I happen to have been born and raised in Japan, they still might be like, "Whoa, you're good at Japanese." Like I've met people that they look white, but they were born and raised in Japan. So literally Japanese is their native language. They sound completely native and they'll still get compliments on their Japanese being so fluent. So there's the appearance aspect, but there's also the aspect where it's actually still relatively rare for a foreigner to reach a high level of fluency in Japanese, even if they have been living
Yeah.
in Japan for a long time. And
Yeah.
it's
Right.
super common to meet foreigners that have been here for 10 plus years and they still only speak like basic survival level Japanese. So I find that, and the other thing is my Japanese is not literally perfect. Like there's still little tiny quirks in my accent and stuff that I think native speakers can pick up on. So I think their impression is that I'm a foreigner who learned Japanese to an incredibly high level, and most most Japanese people I meet have never actually met a foreigner that speaks Japanese as well as me. So generally they are pretty mind blown, and many times we'll have to go through this, like, kind of them getting used to it so that we can kind of move on and just focus on the
Okay,
content of
wow.
the conversation. Because they'll, every 2 minutes they'll be like, I still just can't believe how good you are at Japanese. Are you sure? Like, I've had people like, are you sure you didn't grow up in Japan? Are you like playing with me? Stuff like that. I mean, it depends on the person. Generally, it's the older generations that can't have a
Right,
harder
okay.
time
Yeah.
like accepting the reality, whereas younger people are more like, okay, cool, you're good at Japanese, nice. So yeah,
Right,
but
right.
it's fun.
Uh,
It's fun.
yeah, I'm just wondering if you could explain to people. I'm sure that your views on language learning and how to learn a language that has changed over time. But what was the sort of initial, program that you went through, and what was it like daily when you were in the U.S.?
Yeah, yeah. So the core of my approach, that from back in the day, that's still true to this day, is very, very input focused. Input has always been the central pillar of everything that I do. And so what I was doing back then was, yeah, I mean, at the very, very beginning, I started using anime with Japanese subtitles.
Huh?
And so, the anime was in Japanese, and then there were matching Japanese subtitles. And that way I could easily look up the words that I didn't know and stuff like that. But pretty quickly early on, I started to kind of split the reading and listening into separate activities. And so I would have time where I would just be watching anime with completely raw with no subtitles, and then I would actually read books. And pretty early on, I started reading light novels in Japanese, which are basically just novels. And yeah, I jumped into those pretty early on, even though I had very low comprehension at first, and just kind of plowed my way through, looking things up and accepting the fact that my comprehension was very blurry. And so that was the main thing I was doing, was just getting input in native content, even though my comprehension was pretty low at the beginning. And then I also looked up a lot of words and made a lot of Anki cards. I made specifically
Okay.
like sentence cards where I would take whole sentences out of the content that I was consuming, and I would put them on the front, and then I would put the definition of the unknown word on the back. And also from pretty early on, I was using a Japanese monolingual dictionary, so a Japanese to Japanese dictionary. So my whole learning process was in Japanese. And yeah, basically I would do this for 6 to 10 hours a day when I could. I would watch anime for 4 or 5, maybe like 3 4 hours a day, and then I would take the audio from the shows that I had watched and put it on my little iPod shuffle that I had. And then I would have, back in the day, there weren't AirPods yet, so I had wired headphones kind of dangling out of my shirt. And the nice thing about the iPod Nano is the battery, or the iPod Shuffle, I don't even remember what it was. The battery was amazing, so you could just keep it playing nonstop for multiple days before the battery would run out. So I wouldn't
Right.
even pause it;
Multiple
I would just
days.
keep it
Okay.
running.
Wow.
Yeah, or at least well over 24 hours. Like back then, the batteries on devices lasted way longer than they do nowadays. So I wouldn't even bother to pause it. I would just keep it playing 24/7, and then whenever I had even literally like 10 seconds of dead time, I would put one of the headphones in and then listen to Japanese. So pretty much the only time that I wasn't listening to Japanese was when I was reading Japanese, because I couldn't focus on reading while I was listening, so then I take it out, or when I was actually having a conversation with someone like a family member or a friend. But for the most part, I was very, very focused. I would try to get as close to 24 hours a day exposure to Japanese as possible for that initial couple years of doing really hardcore immersion.
Wow, okay. And so I'm guessing here a lot more listening than reading. In terms of reading, how many hours a day you would say?
Yeah, so in terms of active, because I always kind of split up my input into active immersion and passive immersion. So, active immersion is when I was totally focused on what was happening, it wasn't in the background. And so it was probably close to 50-50 in terms of reading and listening. Like I would read for maybe 3 4 hours a day, and then I would also
Wow,
watch
okay.
for 3 4 hours a
Okay.
day. But I would do the reading earlier on in the day, because the reading was more intensive. It required more brain power and focus. So obviously earlier on in the day, less tired. So I would do that. And then in the evening when I was kind of tired, then I would just put on anime, which is easier to watch. And so but obviously all the passive time that I got when I was either, traveling somewhere, taking a walk, making food, eating food, I was still listening to Japanese in the background. So if you include the passive time, then I had more reading than listening, or sorry, more listening than reading. But if you only include the active time, it was probably pretty equal.
Right. And for reading, the thing I find difficult is, especially at the beginning, even if you're reading, light novels or simplified texts, there's so many unknowns, and that's really person dependent, I think. Some people
Yeah.
tolerate this very well, and for some people they can't do it. Like there's too many words that they don't know, they're not going to do it. So in your case, you would just look up words using a dictionary. In terms of reading, so you would have a lot of unknown words, you would look them up. And I guess sort of my question here is, so you said 3 or so hours of reading
Hmm.
plus watching anime. I guess this was like your full-time job kind of back then. And this
Yeah,
was
yeah, pretty
when you were
much.
in high school?
Well, so yeah, like I said early on, there was a 6 month period where I studied abroad in Japan because this was taking place when I was in high school. I started learning Japanese really hardcore when I was like 17, and so I was in high school and I studied abroad in Japan. The funny thing was like my host family, I didn't really have a good relationship with. I was going to a Japanese high school where none of the other students spoke English, and it was a very kind of competitive high school where they were all focused on just studying very intensely so that they could pass their college entrance exams. And so, there was a big language barrier. They were, to begin with, more kind of serious, introverted people. I was introverted. So I didn't really make any friends. So mostly what I would do is I'd go to school and a lot of times I would actually skip class, just go to the library and read novels on my own. So even though I was in Japan, mostly I was doing self study. I wasn't, and I was like watching anime instead of like getting input from my environment, which in hindsight probably was not the best use of this opportunity of getting to live in Japan as a high schooler. But that's kind of what happened at the time. So there was that. And then when I came back, instead of going back to normal college, I went to community college because for the 6 months I was in Japan, I wasn't getting actual high school credit. So if I would have gone back to my normal high school, I would have been held back a year, which I didn't want to do. So instead, I went to community college where you have a very free schedule. Like you can choose how many classes you want to take, and it's more like going to college, right? So I was in an environment where besides the actual hours I was in class, like I still had, a certain number of class hours per week. But besides that, I was really on my own and I could, you know, listen to Japanese, study Japanese. And so I kind of just do the bare minimum schoolwork to get by and then spend all the rest of my time on Japanese. And then when I was about 3 years in, I transferred to a 4 year university where there was a lot of Japanese exchange students. And so that was when I started speaking Japanese. And there was a kind of tight knit community of Japanese exchange students where they would just hang out with each other and not really socialize too much with the locals, which happens a lot with Japanese people. And so I kind of jumped in there and I was like the one non-Japanese person hanging out with them because I at that point my Japanese was pretty good. That way I could kind of integrate, being a more normal social human being with continuing the hardcore Japanese exposure.
Right.
And I also was majoring in Japanese, which didn't actually teach me anything because I was already fluent at the time, but it at least didn't require me to have to spend more time on English schoolwork. Like, because the Japanese schoolwork was so easy for me. Basically, I never had to study for it. I could just pass the tests
Really?
without
Okay.
studying.
Okay.
So that's kind of how
Yeah.
I was able to, make that work time wise.
And in terms of, when you got started, I assume that you had, I don't know, like a textbook, some sort of, grammar instruction.
Yeah, so at the very, very beginning, I before I got started with my hardcore immersion, there were Japanese classes at my high school. So when I first got interested in Japanese, I was a freshman in high school. So I went and transferred into the Japanese class, but it was very, very slow because most people were only taking it because there was a language requirement and they liked the other students. The kids at my high school who liked anime chose Japanese instead of Spanish as their like required language, but they weren't really motivated to study. It was already pretty challenging, so it was really really slow and didn't move very quickly. And then yeah, when I got serious about learning Japanese, I went through Taken's grammar guide, which is a pretty well known in the kind of Japanese learning community. It's a pretty bare bones guide of that just kind of covers all the core grammar of Japanese. So I went through that and I made Anki cards for all the example sentences in that.
Uh-huh.
And besides that, I just went into native content and learning things as I came across them. So
Right.
there was some structured component in the form of the Japanese textbooks at my high school and Takem's grammar guide, but overall it was very 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 small portion of my overall
Right.
learning, like subjectively.
Compared to the immersion part. Yeah. And what
Yeah.
about the Anki flashcards? Because I think you've talked with Stephen Krashen, and I haven't talked with him for now, which is a shame. But I tried, sending him a few emails, and he told me he was too busy, apparently.
Mm.
But I think if you asked him, should I do flashcards or should I just do input? He would probably say, and that's just my guess, that input is much more important, and you can sort of forget about the other stuff. What's your opinion on this in terms of did the specifically did Anki and flashcards in general, how helpful was this in terms of retaining vocabulary and learning new stuff?
Yeah, this is a really good question. It gets to the core of, I think, a lot of like the crux of language acquisition here. And ultimately, you definitely don't need Anki. You can learn a language entirely through comprehensible input. In fact, have you heard about ALG, like J. Marvin Brown and automatic language growth program? So there's this super interesting, probably in my opinion, the most interesting kind of case study you could say in all of modern language acquisition, which is there was this guy, this American linguist named J. Marvin Brown, who was basically Stephen Krashen's biggest fan and like biggest disciple. And he, back in the 80s, he read Stephen Krashen's work on the input hypothesis, and he wanted to really put it into practice in the purest form possible, even like a pure form than Krashen himself was implementing it in. So he was an American who went to Thailand and learned the Thai language himself. So he made a school in Thailand to teach the Thai language to foreigners 100% through comprehensible input. So the way he figured out the best way to make it work was, instead of having one teacher in front of a classroom, just kind of speaking into the void, which is kind of the first way the input hypothesis was implemented into a classroom, he had two native speakers that would interact with each other and would kind of do skits with each other. They'd use props, they'd use lots of visuals or draw pictures and things like this, and also sometimes interact directly with the students in order to make input comprehensible and engaging, even to people that were brand new to the language. And he had different levels where they would start off, assuming that you knew literally nothing. And then as your comprehension grew, the content would get gradually more difficult. And he actually forbids students from doing early output. And he forbids students from doing any study whatsoever, using any dictionaries whatsoever, asking any questions about the language. He really wanted it to be a pure comprehensible input approach. And what he found was that it actually worked really well. And students would improve very quickly. In his estimation, it took them about 2,000 hours of comprehensible input to reach fluency in the Thai language. And so it's not very well known, but it is very well documented if you go and look at it. And so learning about this really, it makes it clear beyond the shadow of a doubt. An adult can learn a language just like a child does, purely through comprehensible input, and get amazing results. Now, the thing in my mind, the biggest thing is that most of us don't have access to this type of environment, right? He had two native speakers that were literally trained in creating comprehensible and engaging input, and they were reacting in real time to the students, right? They'd be looking at the facial expressions of the students, seeing when they understood and when they didn't. If they weren't understanding, then they'd do something else to clarify what was going on. And they wouldn't keep moving forward if the students were lost, right? And the school would be 5 hours a day, 5 days a week. So it was like a full-time commitment for people that wanted to learn the language, right? So if you want to, for example, like, first of all, this school doesn't even exist anymore in Thailand. And if you want to learn Japanese, nothing like this has ever really existed, right? So going and just watching anime all day with no subtitles is not the equivalent of going to the school, right? Because it's not going to be comprehensible and it's not going to be engaging to you, right? And so I think the biggest reason why I think it was really important for me to use Anki is because using Anki to memorize what words means makes input that would be otherwise incomprehensible into something that's at least somewhat comprehensible.
Right, right.
And so if you're really just watching purely incomprehensible input, I mean, if it's truly incomprehensible, you're not going to acquire any language. So if you're just like listening to a
Uh-huh.
podcast in a language you understand nothing of, and there's no visual component, it's truly 100% incomprehensible. You can listen for a million hours. I don't think you'll ever acquire the language. When you're watching anime with no subtitles, it will be mostly incomprehensible, but some things will still be comprehensible because there's a visual component. You can see what's going on with the characters. Some things will be able to make sense. So I think you could just watch anime with no subtitles, and eventually you would acquire the language, but it's going to
Uh-huh.
be very slow. It's not going to be efficient. It's going to be way slower than if you went to the school in Thailand, right, and had like ideal comprehensible input. And so that's why I think you need something to make the input comprehensible if you're going to be using this kind of native content. And so Anki is one way to make it comprehensible. There's actually other techniques now that I've been kind of developing with other members of my online community that I run right now. I have a community called Immersion Dojo, and a lot of students there, like one technique that we've been using, we call primed listening, where basically you watch a show with English subtitles, but you use software so that when each English subtitle line comes up, the show automatically pauses for 1 second to let you read the subtitle line. Then it
Okay.
unpauses and hides the subtitle so that then you hear what was spoken without seeing any subtitle. But because you read what was said just a moment earlier, you have the meaning in your head, and now that subtitle line becomes comprehensible, at least in a sense, because you know roughly
Okay.
what's being communicated. Now that gives your brain more of a, well, basically now you're feeding your brain a pair of meaning and language, which it can then, your unconscious mind can use to start breaking, analyzing the language and like acquiring it. So that's one technique. You can also just do things like reading summaries of a show before you watch it. There's a lot of things you can do, or you can just watch shows that you can watch the dubs of shows in your native. You can watch shows that are dubbed in your target language, but you've already seen once in your native language. So there's a lot of things you can do to make native content comprehensible, but you need to probably do something if you want the learning to be efficient. And Anki is one very, very effective way to do that.
Okay. Actually, yeah, I was wondering about this because I've personally found Anki to be super effective in my case for the languages I've learned. But the thing is, even if you're learning, I don't know, 10 new words a day, and when I initially started, my plan was to learn, I don't know, like 20 or 25, which is
Mm,
easy at the start when you don't have any
mm,
reviews, but it becomes literally hell, after a few
yeah.
weeks. But so you have found Anki to be very effective, but it's pretty, heavy duty. I mean, you have to spend some time on it. And when you're doing your reviews, I don't know about you, but it's my mind just is, working 100%. It's very exhausting.
Mm.
So you're saying that you found alternatives to this for making the language more comprehensible. Do you think that this is these techniques that you've described are a good alternative to Anki, or you still have to do Anki?
I mean, I think if you want the most effective results, you should combine both. So that's like I'm learning Chinese right now. I still do some Anki, although I do it in a different way than I used to when I did Japanese. And then I'm
Okay.
also making use of these techniques, from like primed listening and trying to make the input more comprehensible. I think the combination is what's most effective. Something else that I was gonna say, I think. Oh yeah, one like also, the value that Anki provides you depends a lot on where you are in the learning process, because at the very beginning of the learning process, you're learning words that are so common. You're going to be meeting these words every single day for the most part, left and right. And so Anki can still help your brain pick them out of your input more, but even without Anki, you'll probably still be picking up these words pretty quickly anyway. So it's not as important. Whereas I think for me, like when I was doing reading, trying to read novels and things like that, there's a lot of very low frequency words. And by making Anki cards for these low frequency words, it helped me acquire a very broad passive vocabulary much faster than I think I would have been able to do
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
any other way. So I was just making 10 cards a day. I really took a consistency over quantity approach. I would make 10 cards, but I would really make 10 cards every single day. And I did that for pretty much 5 years. And by the end of that, I found that I could read novels very comfortably. And I even knew a lot of those more rare kind of literary vocabulary than a lot of native speakers did. And to this day, that's kind
Right.
of like a strength of mine, where sometimes if you're watching if I'm with Japanese friends and we're watching a movie and there's kind of like a rare poetic fancy word that was in the script, sometimes they won't know what it means, but I'll know what it means because I made an Anki card for it many years ago when it came up in a novel or something. So I think it's actually at those kind of later stages in the language learning
Yeah.
game
Yeah.
where you're really trying to bridge that gap between like a low, maybe like B1, B2 level to like a C1, C2 level, that Anki can play the biggest role, because with those low frequency words, like it even takes native speakers like a couple decades to really grow that level of vocabulary, right? And they're getting constant exposure. So if you want to be able to catch up to them in just a relatively short period of time, like a couple years, I think Anki is probably the only way to do that at that level of speed.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny because with all the academics I talk to, they sort of say the opposite. Not really the opposite, but they say hey, look, if you're going to do flashcards, really the most of your gains are going to happen with, I don't know, like the 2000 or so most frequent words in a language, which is true, but it's also
Yeah.
true that if you just do immersion, then these are so frequent that you're going to acquire them anyway. But Anki can speed things up definitely.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, in terms of really low frequency words, it's so hard to just do immersion, and you encounter a word once a year, or even if that, then with Anki is just a systematic way of reviewing that word regularly. So I've actually made shameless plug here for my Anki decks at ankicoredex.com. I also have Japanese, by the way, and these decks have about I think a little bit less now because I've applied some different filters, but 8,000 to 11,000 words, sorted by frequency. So it can be a pretty, scary to have to do the 10,000, 11,000 words, but really those low frequency words at the end, it's really hard to acquire if you don't do it systematically with Anki. I want to talk about your learning Chinese, and how far, how fluent are you right now in Chinese?
I mean, I'm definitely not very far along. I only kind of
Okay.
really picked it back up like 3 months ago.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, basically in the last couple years after learning about, like, for example, that school in Thailand that I talked about, and a couple other things. And also, yeah, a lot has been kind of leading me in this direction for many years now. But I kind of came up with this hypothesis that I actually believe very strongly in now, that the ideal way to learn a language is to first learn the spoken language and then learn how to read and write after that. So basically
Okay.
you're following the same order that natives do, right? Natives first listen, they build comprehension, then they start speaking, and then after they're already essentially fluent in the spoken language, do they go to school and learn how to read and write? And I think that learning through reading early on has many benefits. It can speed up the process in certain ways, but there's also a lot of downsides that have been kind of not noticed or kind of neglected by the language learning community at large. And I actually feel like I was very negatively affected by these downsides with my own personal Japanese. And
Okay.
it's been a lot of work to overcome these things. And I also noticed that all the people that sound the most native like in Japanese, that learn Japanese as an adult, are the people that learn mostly through listening. So I think it's kind of like
Okay.
a different process that oftentimes goes on in your brain when you're learning through listening versus listening through reading.
Right.
And so yeah, the kind of newest version of my recommendations for how to learn a language that I'm teaching in my online community revolve around first learning through listening and then doing reading after you already have a basic level of fluency in the spoken language. And because that is a pretty big departure from what I personally did, I feel like I need to gain experience in this own method myself so that I can also be speaking from experience when I'm working with students and things like that. So that was the biggest motivation for picking back up Chinese. I've learned Chinese a little bit on and off throughout the years, but I always ended up just deciding that it'd be better to focus even more on Japanese. But now that I'm living in Japan and Japanese is more integrated into my daily life, I feel like I'm able to kind of balance both a little more. And so yeah, I'm still basically just in the very early stages working on comprehension of work, like mainly watching content, building up my comprehension. I did take a trip to Hong Kong a couple weeks ago and ended up having to kind of speak Mandarin a little bit, even though in I wasn't planning on it. But there were just certain times where, like, I was at a restaurant and the waitress literally spoke no English and Mandarin was the only kind of common language that we had. And I found that I was able to use what I had picked up and like get across
Nice.
very basic points that I had to get across. So that was fun. But ultimately, I'm definitely still in very very early days, just trying to build up my comprehension. You know.
Cool. And I'll definitely put a link in the description to your community, because I've checked it out as well. There's a huge community of people. I don't know, hundreds of people. They're participating in different posts, and there are also courses. If you go to the, I don't know, it's called the classroom tab or whatever. So you don't just get a community. There are also courses, and obviously people can interact with each other and with you, obviously. So it's good value. But in terms of learning Chinese, so I suppose now that you've just started recently, so I'm guessing that compared to your Japanese journey, you're really implementing all of your sort of
Yeah.
new philosophy. Could you describe that a little bit? I'm guessing that it's going to be somewhat different from, AJAT and
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
the stuff that you use. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, at the core, like the most fundamental principles are the same still because it's about input, right? Learning and mainly input that's coming through content and about building up your intuition for the language, really building an unconscious model of how the language works so that then when you go to output, it will just come naturally and hopefully feel a lot like your native language. But yeah, what I've come to realize is that basically when you like the way we acquire our native language is entirely unconscious, right? There's a basically unconscious pattern recognition parts of our brain that take statistics and analysis on all the input that we're getting, and then it builds an unconscious model of how the language works. And that's why for our native language, we can say when something's not grammatical or something's mispronounced, but we often can't explain what rule it's actually breaking or exactly why it's wrong, right? We just know
Black box.
it's not this, it's this, right? So some unconscious part of our mind has a very nuanced understanding of how that thing works, but consciously we don't know how it works. And so it's that unconscious intuitive understanding that allows you to function like a native speaker. So what I've realized is when you kind of consciously learn a language, like for example, you take a grammar textbook and you build a conscious model of how the grammar of the language works, well, probably that conscious model, it's a nice shortcut. Like you can build it very quickly, right? You can spend a couple weeks memorizing the content of a textbook and then be able to basically use the grammar knowledge to translate your thoughts into the target language and say something that will hopefully get your point across. But that model that you built consciously in this kind of top-down way is going to have very different properties than the unconscious model that naturally arises in a bottom-up way through getting lots of input and understanding lots of input. Right? There's probably going to be, it's not going to be as nuanced. There's going to be many edge cases or many things that your conscious model misses. But what can happen is once you install that conscious model, you start interpreting the language, even the input that you're getting through that unconscious model. And there's a certain process in which the input itself shapes the model you have and adds more nuance and adds more depth to it and moves it closer to the same model that a native speaker has in their head. But there's also an aspect where because you're viewing the language through the lens of this model that you built that has certain limitations and certain flaws in it, it biases the way your brain interprets the input, and it makes it so that even in response to potentially tens of thousands of hours of input, you never converge with the same exact model that a native speaker has. And I think this is the core reason for fossilization, right? It's very common for someone to get far beyond 10,000 hours of input in a language. Like I've met people who have been living in Japan for multiple decades. Their family might be like their wife might be Japanese. They only speak to their wife in Japanese. They only use Japanese in their work. They'll be at a high level of fluency, but at a certain point, their ability plateaued and they stopped moving towards a convergence with fully native level. They still might have many pronunciation quirks, grammar quirks. They might use some words in unnatural ways. Yet, even though they're continuing to get input, they don't get any better. So there's kind of some point where you reach some kind of equilibrium with your brain where the original false model you had kind of becomes good enough for you to get by. It doesn't converge fully with the native speaker's model. So I think
Oh
as much
wait,
as
so that
possible,
that's kind of scary actually. So how do you undo that? Because it's funny because today I was in a Nike shop and
Mhm.
I met this woman and I recognized her. Like I go to this Thai massage place, nothing nasty, it's just a Thai massage. But and there was this masseuse and she recognized me and we started talking, in French. I'm not sure I can say that, but and she was talking and I was like, what are you what's going on? And then I saw next to her was like her daughter, and next to her daughter was her husband who's like obviously French, and her daughter is like this Asian, but she's also blonde and stuff. And how do they even communicate? Because I
Mm.
can't understand like anything that she said, and she's been here, I'm guessing, for decades. I hope that she's not watching this, but I'm guessing she's not. But my point is, how do you? I mean, that's kind of scary, right? People just
Yeah,
fossilize, and
yeah.
do you think
Yeah.
you can avoid this? And
Yeah. So basically, I think with cases like that, it's funny. I met a similar Japanese woman the other day who had lived in the US for like her entire adult life, had been married and divorced to an American man who spoke no Japanese. She was working in English and her English was just terrible. I'm like, to the point where she kept like speaking English to kind of show off. And I'm like, I have to focus so hard to understand what you're saying. Can you just speak Japanese? It'll be a lot easier for me to understand. I think in those cases, it's when people start outputting very early on, what they're really doing, right, is they're thinking, like in this case, this Japanese woman was thinking in Japanese, using these very crude grammar rules and heuristics to translate those
uh-huh.
thoughts into English, and saying those obviously result in language that's very far from what a native speaker would say. And then those become habits that become very ingrained, and even more input won't change those. So just putting off output, or at least getting very strict feedback whenever you do output, can help you avoid that first layer of like fossilizing with very poor level of output. But even like for people with me and other people, there's people who like take a very input heavy approach. They wait to output, but still don't fully converge. They'll get to a very good level, but won't fully converge with the native speaker. And I think that's because there's still this subtle phenomenon, like I said, of even if you're not speaking yourself, the way you're interpreting the language uses conscious modules you've installed in your brain through study that aren't quite the same as what the native speaker has, right? Because the native speaker,
Okay.
everything emerged organically through input, right? There was no top-down enforcing. So in terms of like what can you do, I think that nothing is completely permanent. You can always go back and kind of manually improve any aspect of your language ability that you want to. So like for me in Japanese, I think because I took this reading heavy approach, I completely failed to acquire pitch accent, which is a pretty important, well, one of the most fundamental aspects of Japanese pronunciation. So, I mean, I can go into the details of what exactly it is, but the important thing is there's a big aspect of Japanese pronunciation that I completely just didn't acquire. When I spoke, I completely missed this aspect of the Japanese accent. And so I basically went back and I had to train myself to hear it, first of all, through like deliberate training. And then I had to kind of build a model in my head of what the right of what it should be, and then train myself to every time I speak, do it the right way. And just practice that over and over and over until it became part of my model of the Japanese language. And now I speak Japanese with like very good pitch accent, not completely perfect,
Okay.
but 98, 99% accuracy, whereas I started off probably like 60% accuracy. So it was like a huge improvement, right? It took a lot of work and, many years of kind of dedication, but I was able to do that. So I think for any aspect of your language ability, if there's something that your brain kind of just failed to acquire for whatever reason, you can go and learn about that thing, train yourself to become more sensitive to that thing, train yourself to produce it the right way when you speak. You can improve it, but it's a very slow, very deliberate process. You have to kind of choose one thing at a time, put in the effort. And so ideally, you would just acquire it naturally through input the first time, right? So for example, my method now, it's all about how do we avoid this interference is what I call it. That leads you to plateau at a certain level beyond a native speaker when you're just getting input, so that you can have to minimize the amount of manual effort you have to put in to kind of bridge that gap between wherever you plateau just through input and where a native speaker is, right? And part of what inspired this is the observation that people plateau at completely different levels, right? Some people, they just take an input heavy approach. They get very, very close to native speaker. Other people end up with like that lady you just mentioned who are not even close. So what's the difference here? I don't think it's just talent. In fact, I think talent's a relatively small part of it. I think it has to do with how much are you letting your unconscious mind naturally kind of organically build a model, and how much are you kind of forcing it with your conscious mind, and then that creates these kind of biases in the way that your brain processes the language. So my whole method is about minimizing this interference. So it's basically you trying to minimize grammar study,
Okay.
take vocabulary in a very deliberate way. So yeah, for grammar, I actually think that now you should acquire as much as possible, acquire and not learn grammar. So, for
Okay.
example, in Japanese in particular, there's this amazing service now called Comprehensible Input Japanese, and similar things exist for other language. But basically, it's kind of the video form of that school in Thailand that I mentioned, where there's this Japanese woman who, at first, it was just her, but now she's built a whole team who started making videos where she's speaking Japanese and she's not teaching you anything. She's just telling stories or talking about basic ideas in Japanese, but she's using visuals and hand gestures and going very slowly so that it's clear roughly what she's saying, even when you don't speak any of the language at all. It's kind of like if you've seen that demonstration that Stephen Krashen gave of the lesson in German where he's like, this is Spock, he has 2 ears and 2 eyes. It's basically like that, but there's just like hundreds of hours of that content, and then it gradually, the level of difficulty increases. And so there's actually what inspired this kind of direction of my thinking is there's a member of my online community who started Japanese from scratch, did nothing but watch these comprehensible input Japanese videos for a couple hundred hours, and then he got to the point where he could understand like basic Japanese YouTube videos like 80 or 90%,
Okay.
like native normal videos. So he acquired all the basic grammar and vocabulary just through comprehensible input. So I still think that right now with the videos, there's still like you're still going to reach a point where you can understand all the highest level of comprehensible input content, but when you go to watch purely native content, there's still kind of a gap there you need a bridge. So that's when these techniques that I talked about of like using the primed listening, where you kind of have the English subtitles first and then you take them away and things like that, and involving Anki as well. I still think you want to do these things. But ideally, if you let your brain just naturally acquire the grammar, then you're going to end up with a model in your head much similar to the model native speakers have, than rather you consciously build the model. So I think there's that. And then for vocabulary, what I've been doing for Chinese, what I recommend people to do is to do it all through audio. So another member of my community built an Anki add-on where you can basically enter a OpenAI API key and then set it all up, and then it will basically look at the word in your Anki card, and then it will generate what I've been calling a conceptual definition. So instead of it just telling you like a direct translation into your native language, it will explain what the concept means. And so it's kind
Okay.
of like almost like a monolingual definition, but in English. So like for example, if I learn like 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 there's a lot of words in Japanese, right? In fact, most of the words in Japanese, they don't have a direct English translation, right? So, for example, it's like a word in Japanese, here's a really common example. So like there's this word in Japanese, dokushin, and when you look it up in the common like Japanese to English dictionary that most Japanese learners use, it's the first translation that's listed is the word single.
Hmm.
And so most people or a lot of Japanese learners will mislearn this word, and they'll think that it means basically that you're not in a relationship, right? Like you don't have like a committed partner. So if you don't have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, you are dokushin. When in reality, what the word dokushin means in Japanese is that you're not married. It means that you're like a bachelor. So, and of course, the word single in English can also have this meaning, right, on like legal forms, but the dictionary doesn't specify this, right? So a lot of times people will be in Japanese and some will be speaking Japanese, and someone will ask them like, "Are you dating anyone right now?" And they'll be like, "Oh no, I'm dokushin." Right? And it'll kind of be weird because it's kind of like that wasn't really what they're asking, right? They weren't asking if you're married, they were asking if you have a boyfriend or girlfriend, right? And sometimes maybe they'll say, "Oh, I'm not dokushin, I have a girlfriend," even though they really are dokushin and they have a girlfriend, right? They're just not married.
Okay.
And so instead, I have this kind of prompt that I made that tells ChatGPT to basically be like, don't just give me a direct English translation, explain what the concept of the word means, so that
Okay.
I don't end up kind of conflating it with an English definition. And then the ChatGPT might actually come up with something like, oh, this word means that you are not married. And if I just take in that as a whole sentence instead of a single translation, now I don't end up with that misunderstanding. So that's a really obvious example. But there's a lot of other examples where the difference is a lot more subtle and harder to explain, right? Like, for example, if you take the word like kire in Japanese, that means something kind of like beautiful or kind of like pretty, but it also has subtly different nuances than both of those, right? If you memorize the word kire as, oh, this is how you say that something is beautiful in Japanese, or this is something that's like pretty in Japanese, then in some contexts that will work. In other contexts, your understanding will be a little off. And so it's very dangerous making these one-to-one kind of connections in your head between an English word and a Japanese word, because the nuance is always going to be different. So rather than and once you make those connections, sometimes those wires, they're very hard to uncross. And so like even to the point where like for me in Japanese, when I was learning Japanese, I did use these types of one-to-one connections. And now sometimes that made it so that it actually messes up my English. Like one example is there's this word abunai, which is often translated to mean like dangerous in Japanese. And so when I was first learning Japanese, I was taught abunai equals dangerous. I kind of memorized that. Those two words got connected in my head. And then later, through getting lots of Japanese input, my understanding of the word abunai developed and became more nuanced. And I started to realize it was used in ways that the English word dangerous wasn't. Like, for one example, is that, if you're like almost run over by a car or something, then a Japanese person would be like, abunai, almost to be like, watch out or be careful, right? Or like, oh, something bad almost happened, right? Whereas in English, we wouldn't just say like, oh, dangerous, right? We would probably say like, watch out or something, right? But now, sometimes, like the other day, I was playing Tetris and I almost I had a really good game going and I almost put a piece in a place that would have like ruined my stack, and then I instinctively almost was like, oh, that was dangerous, right? Where that's not really how a native speaker would use this word, right? But because dangerous and abunai are like connected in my head, even though my updating my understanding of abunai like inadvertently updated my understanding of dangerous in a way that it shouldn't be, right? Because there's this arbitrary connection between the two in my head. So that was one weird example, but most of the time it goes in the opposite direction, right? Whereas people are still, whenever I hear foreigners that are they'll still be very fluent in Japanese, but they'll be using words in ways that are slightly off because they're still being pulled in the direction of the way that the closest English equivalent is used. So by using these conceptual definitions, you can learn a word without it being directly attached to any single English concept or English word. And I think that's going to allow you to avoid this type of interference. So that's like one other component of my new method that's all about how do you keep your model kind of clean and not tainted by either English or conscious frameworks you build that have lacked the nuance of the real language. Sorry, that was like a really
Right.
long answer.
No, that's really cool, and for sure I'll put a link to your community in the description because I'm assuming that all of this information is
Yeah.
available there. So I'll put a link to this in the description. I just want to talk about a little bit about yourself for the end of this interview. So you haven't posted. I mean, you've been posting videos recently. You posted 2 videos. One of them did really well, actually. The I suppose this is for like the school in Thailand. Is
Yep. Yep.
that correct? Yeah, that did pretty well. Seems like you keep, just hitting home runs with videos very frequently. But so you haven't posted in like 3 years, I think. So could you tell us what happened during these 3 years?
Yeah, yeah. So initially, I took a break from making regular videos because I taught this pretty closed group pitch accent course that just had a couple hundred members. And then in the middle of that, I moved to Japan. And so once I moved to Japan and had taken a little bit of time off from doing like constant YouTube, because I basically had done constant YouTube for like 4 years at that point. And so it was really nice to kind of take a step back from the internet for a while and kind of go and like live offline and touch grass, I guess you could say. And also, yeah, I moved to Japan about 3 years ago, and at that point, I hadn't been to Japan even a single time in 10 years. Like I didn't even visit Japan one time for that whole period. So, yeah, I had that study abroad in high school where I was there for 6 months. I came back, I learned Japanese, but then I didn't go to Japan even one time. So it was my first time being in Japan for 10 years. It was my first time being fluent in the language while I was in Japan. And so yeah, it was just a super. I went through like probably the most intense honeymoon phase ever that anyone ever had of like moving to Japan. So yeah, for the most of those 3 years, I was kind of just enjoying my long overdue, experience of actually directly interacting with the Japanese country and culture. And I was still teaching a small group of private students throughout that period of time. And I was initially doing a kind of study abroad in Japan, mostly just for the visa, but that also took up some time. So yeah, I mean, before I knew it, it had been so long. And like also in my head, the longer I waited to come back, the bigger the kind of like hurdle was. It was like, oh, I have to come back with a bang. And then that was so much pressure. I
Yeah.
kind of ended up putting it off for probably longer than I should have. But yeah, that was kind of what I was mostly just living offline, enjoying my life, and teaching a kind of small group of private students throughout that period of time.
Yeah, that's pretty cool actually, and I'm sure that in the future. So actually, what are you going to do in the future with the YouTube channel? Do you have any plans for it, or maybe other
Yeah,
platforms?
yeah. Well, yeah. So basically, I want to make a lot of. I want to take all these new ideas that I have. So, like, yeah, right now, I kind of told you some of these new ideas I have about how being aware of the fact that certain things in the language learning process might have negative effects that are pretty long lasting and potentially trying to work around those or avoid those. So all those new ideas are pretty new. I'm for now or for the last like couple of months, I've been putting them all on my community and working with certain members and kind of refining the ideas. And it's been a very, very kind of fruitful process because a lot of the members will have new ideas I didn't have. They'll try ideas and run into problems, and then we'll kind of troubleshoot them all together. And I've been also experimenting with different ways of communicating the ideas. So now that things have kind of started to really take shape, I want to eventually just make lots of YouTube videos going over these ideas and teaching all the new techniques that I kind of come up with and giving new perspective on language learning that I have. So kind of basically just pick up where I left off a couple years ago with my YouTube channel and just make those kind of long, mid to long form videos where I'm doing deep dives on language learning topics for people that are really serious about language learning. And then also, like I said, I want to start building up my Japanese audience and start teaching them all these same ideas as well, so that they can use immersion to learn English. And that's also, yeah, I'm pretty excited about that because that's also kind of way overdue as well. So, um, yeah, kind of my kind of goal I think would be cool is to kind of have those two things join, and maybe try to get, like, right now almost everybody in my community are in my immersion dojo community are English speakers that are learning Japanese, and there's also some Chinese learners and Korean learners, some other people, but mostly Japanese learners. So I think it would be cool to try to build a Japanese audience of people learning English using the same method, and then get them into the same community, and then we can naturally, people can find language partners that share the same language learning methodology, because that's something that I think a lot of people struggle with is, if you get into these immersion techniques, it's hard. A lot of people don't, understand them or have any context for them. So then you try to find a language partner and they want you to do things that from your perspective aren't really productive. They don't want to do the things that are productive from your perspective. And so there's that kind of issue of just being on the same page from a language learning perspective. So I think it would be cool to kind of make this community where Japanese people learning English and then English speakers learning Japanese can, meet each other and support each other in the process and do crosstalk and be output partners and things like that.
Yeah, well, that's pretty ambitious. And actually, I was wondering in terms of your community. So you have mostly Japanese learners, but I guess the content, I mean, the techniques apply to really any kind of language. As a matter
Yeah,
of fact,
yeah.
if you're an English speaker learning Spanish, which is pretty popular, or French, you use these techniques. I mean, I can tell you that because these languages are so much easier than Japanese, you're going to be fluent in a lot less time. So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
just want
especially
to,
with
yeah,
just add on that real quick. Like, even now, more than my content was always like kind of focused on Japanese, but was very easy to apply to other languages. But now that a big part of the method is focusing on listening first and reading later, and you could say it's even more language agnostic because the Japanese writing system, right, presents a lot of challenges with learning kanji and things like that. But now that those are kind of a little bit later down the line, the initial part of the process is even more similar, regardless of what language you're learning. So yeah, and if you're learning Spanish, there's Dreaming Spanish, which is kind of like the equivalent of the comprehensible input Japanese service I gave, where you can, with Dreaming Spanish, a lot of people know about it, so I won't like go into it too much, but you can easily acquire all the basic grammar and vocab just through comprehensible input. So yeah, some languages have more those resources developed more than other languages, but probably Spanish is probably the one that's furthest developed right now, because of Pablo and Dreaming Spanish. So yeah.
actually, a lot of people have requested that I talk with Pablo, but I'm totally unfamiliar with learning Spanish because I'm not learning Spanish, and
Yeah, well,
so
Pablo actually went to that school in Thailand that I mentioned and
okay,
learned
interesting.
Thai
Yeah,
at that school all through
okay,
comprehensible input. And so I think he kind of took that same method and that same idea and created it for people learning Spanish because he's a native Spanish speaker. So what my understanding is, what Dreaming Spanish is basically just a series of videos where there's hundreds of hours of just comprehensible input content where you can just start, and it's sorted by level, so you can just start from zero and watch it and pick up Spanish just by through comprehensible input without having to learn grammar or anything like that. Yeah, I think if you combine that with other things like Anki, and another part of my method that I didn't talk about was like deliberately doing ear training and pronunciation training to
okay.
expedite the process of acquiring the sound system. I think it's like a good base. You can power it up with these couple other techniques and make it even faster and more efficient. But as a base, yeah, it's the most important component is that comprehensible input. So hopefully it gets built out for more languages as well.
Yeah, that's it's just so hard to get all of this content now. Hopefully, with AI, this is going to facilitate
Yeah.
all this. I just want to end this interview with a series of rapid questions, and then there's going to be a closing question as well. So, just really rapid questions. First, anime or Japanese dramas for learning?
I mean, overall, probably anime, just because they're way better made, and there's way more of them. There's the breadth of genres they cover is so much broader. If you're on average, the language used is farther away from real life, so there is that. But like, you need to consume so much content in the language. Anime provides a lot of sustenance.
Yeah, I agree on that. Yeah. Second question, subtitles, are they necessary or an absolute no?
It's all about how you use them. Actually, over time, I used to be a fan of like target language subtitles, and I used to think that native language subtitles were kind of evil. Now I've kind of taken a whole 180, where, like I said, if you're using them in the right method, like I said, like that technique where it shows you the subtitle line, but then it hides it so that when you're listening to the target language audio, you're not seeing the subtitle line, then I think that's actually super effective. But if you're just watching the show with English subtitles and you're not doing anything deliberate to learn, you're just going to filter out the language and not learn anything. So I think they can be a great tool if you use them in the right way.
Right. A third question, one Japanese word that perfectly captures something that English can't.
Yeah, I mean, the first word that pops into mind, I mean, kind of like two, I guess. Like one is yoyu, the other one is kodawari. Because they're not captured in English, it's really hard to explain. But yoyu basically means like whatever amount you need of something to get by as the bare minimum, you have it's like the amount extra you have, right? So if you have to be somewhere by 10:30 and you're there by, 10:20, you have 10 minutes of yoyu. But it's also used in a metaphorical way lots of times to just kind of mean you have like psychological abundance in a way, or kind of just like an overall abundant attitude towards life. Like a lot of girls say like, oh, I want a guy that has yo-yo. That's like who I'm attracted to, right? Someone who just kind of doesn't really seem like they're on edge. They just have a kind of relaxed, abundant mindset or something, right? I like that word because there's a lot of situations where it comes in handy, and I find myself, even when I'm speaking English, having that Japanese word pop up, and I have trouble finding a way to say it in English a lot of times. Kodawari also just means like a preference that you have because of kind of like almost like a personal philosophy that you have, where like
Right.
if you don't have kodawari, it means either one's fine. I don't care. If you have a kodawari, it kind of means like, oh, I have some kind of personal philosophy which is why I think it has to be this way and not some other way. So it's yeah, it comes in handy. You can use it in really simple ways, like um if you're at a store and there's like three different types of water, and you're gonna ask your friend like, hey, which, like, do you care which one I get? You can be like, hey, do you have a kodawari of like which water company you get? Like, even though they're probably all the same, maybe they'll say like, oh yeah, I always like this one. This is my kodawari. Or maybe they'll be like, no, I don't have a kodawari on this. You can pick anyone, right? But also you can use it about your life philosophy of like, oh, I have a kodawari where I only watch foreign movies with subtitles. I never watch the dub, right? Or my kodawari is I you know I want to date someone who's bilingual or something. I'm not like that, but just random things, you can use it like that. It comes in handy in a lot of ways.
Right. Yeah. The type of word that's pretty nuanced, and you really have to do immersion to really capture the full
Yeah.
meaning of these words. Your most overused Japanese phrase.
Yeah, actually, my Japanese girlfriend points these out to me a lot. So, I mean, probably the worst one is just sono, which I use as a filler word, like in Japanese. Like when I don't think I use it that much in conversation, but if I try to film a video in Japanese where I'm just doing a long monologue or I'm explaining some high level abstract concept, I'll find I use that way too much. Or what were some of the other ones that get pointed out? Like maybe like, yeah, I think so. I think my girlfriend told me I said tashkani a lot, like, oh, tashkani, which is just like something that means like, yeah, oh yeah, good point, good point, things
Right.
like
Right.
that. There's a lot. It's probably a lot of those little filler things in between the conversations. You can yeah, lean on them a little too much sometimes.
Cool. Last rapid question. Japanese convenience store food, is it overrated or underrated?
Honestly, you're probably gonna have to say that it's overrated
Yeah.
because like when I first moved to Japan, I thought it was amazing. Like I for like every day for lunch, I would get like a onigiri and like the oyocha tea. And but the longer that I've lived here, the more that my I guess my palate has developed, and I've started to be able to really notice the difference between good Japanese food and low quality Japanese food. And not even just convenience store food, but even like the Japanese fast food places, like the like Skiya or like Yoshinoya or even like Torikizoku. Like there's a lot of these places where they're like cheap fast places. When I first came to Japan, they were like amazing. I was like, how can you get something this good this fast for this cheap? But now I can tell it kind of tastes like fast food, as like I my like standards have raised. And so yeah, with convenience store food, like, yeah, if you're hungry and you have no time, it's good. But it's also not very good for you because there's lots of preservatives in there. And there's actually this joke that I've heard a Japanese person make where they say that if you eat too much convenience store food, when you die your body won't rot because there'll be so much preservatives like in your body. Yeah, I think the people that are saying that, some of the social media gets really overhyped. So yeah, probably overall,
Yeah, I
probably a
think,
little over.
and I went to Japan just once, about, I would say, 10 years ago, and being someone who doesn't eat any meat or fish, or I was like
Mm.
starving.
It
Really,
rules out a
not
lot of
many
stuff.
options. Yeah, being vegan is not
Yeah.
very popular in Japan. It
No,
seems so.
definitely not. Yeah, that'd be hard. I mean, I'd say overall, kombinis are not overrated. Kombinis as a whole are really convenient because, like, you can, if you ever actually need something, they're like you need a band-aid, or like your friend decides to stay over last minute and you need another toothbrush, or like any actual thing that you need for your life, you can because they're always going to be like only 1 minute away, right? Like I have two different kombinis, like a minute away. So a lot of times they'll actually save the day when you really need something last minute. So overall, I think kombinis are awesome, and they're one of the top things that I think makes living in Japan super convenient. And sometimes the food is part of that if you need something last minute really quick. But like, yeah, I wouldn't rely on that as like a regular meal in your weekly diet.
Sure, yeah. So this is going to be the closing question for someone who's starting to learn a language, Japanese or not Japanese. After this interview, what's the one thing that they should do, or what's the one thing that they should remember, take away from this video, you think?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I mean, the number one thing that I would encourage people to do is try to focus more on listening than reading early on. And
Mhm.
even if you feel like you're someone who's like a visual learner or that learning through listening is not possible, I would kind of reconsider that assumption because a lot of times you're just not used to it. And early on, learning through listening can seem really hard because, it's when you see a word written out in text, it's very clear cut. It's easy to grasp onto. You can copy and paste it into a dictionary. Whereas when you're listening, it's kind of amorphous. You don't really know exactly what you heard. But if you stick with it and you develop the kind of meta skill of being able to parse the sounds of the language and you just get used to it, it gets easier and easier. And in fact, it can make learning even easier than reading because once you really establish yourself in the spoken language, you can pick things up even when you're just passively listening on the train or on your commute or when you're taking a walk. It actually opens up a lot of possibilities. And I think it's going to lead you to having the most natural language ability in the long term because ultimately we all acquired our native language through listening. I think it's the most natural way to acquire a language. So I would encourage people to put a little more effort into finding a way to make it work before you kind of, you know, write that off as something that's not going to work for you.
Great. Well, Matt, thank you so much. Once again, I'm going to put a link to Matt's community in the description of this video and even on Spotify, wherever you're listening to this. And Matt, thank you so much.
Yeah, it was fun. Thanks for having me.